Picture a Roman lawyer in the middle of his most passionate argument, building toward a devastating conclusion that will win his case, and then an attendant signals that his time is up because the water has run out, and he must stop speaking immediately, mid-sentence if necessary, because a simple clay pot dripping water has more authority in this courtroom than his eloquence. So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and get ready to explore how Romans kept time without mechanical clocks using ingenious water devices called clepsydra. Discover why a lawyer's speech could be cut off the moment the last drop fell. Understand how soldiers standing guard in the freezing darkness knew exactly when their shift ended, and learn what the clepsydra's physics, the float regulator innovation, the four-watch military system, and the strange concept of hours that changed length with the seasons reveals about why Roman timekeeping was both remarkably clever and frustratingly imprecise. Time is something we take for granted today. We glance at our phones, our watches, the clock on the wall, and we know exactly what time it is, down to the second if we want. But for most of human history, measuring time with any precision was extraordinarily difficult. The Romans, who built roads and aqueducts and conquered the Mediterranean world, who created legal systems and military organizations that still influence us today, had to measure time without any of the mechanical or electronic devices we rely on. Their solution was elegant, practical, and limited. They used water. The clepsydra, that's the Greek word the Romans adopted, meaning water thief, was a device that measured time by the controlled flow of water. In its simplest form, it was just a container with a small hole near the bottom. You filled it with water, and the water dripped out at a roughly constant rate. When the container was empty, a known amount of time had passed. Simple in concept, surprisingly complex in practice, and absolutely essential to Roman legal, military, and social life. The Romans didn't invent water clocks. The Egyptians had been using them for over 1,000 years before Rome rose to power. The Greeks refined them significantly, developing more sophisticated designs that the Romans then adopted and further improved. But it was the Romans who integrated water clocks most thoroughly into their institutional life, using them to regulate everything from courtroom speeches to military guard shifts to dinner party entertainment. Let's start with the basic physics, because understanding how a clepsydra worked helps explain both its usefulness and its limitations. Water flows through a hole at a rate determined by several factors: the size of the hole, the pressure pushing the water through, and the properties of the water itself. The pressure depends on the height of water above the hole. More water means more pressure, which means faster flow. This creates an immediate problem. As water drains from a simple container, the flow rate decreases because there's less water pushing down. A container that takes 10 minutes to drain the first half might take 15 minutes to drain the second half. The Romans and Greeks solved this problem in several ways. The simplest was to use the clepsydra only for short intervals, refilling it frequently so the water level never dropped too much. A more elegant solution was to use a conical vessel, wider at the top, narrower at the bottom. The shape compensated for the decreasing pressure. As the water level dropped, the narrower vessel meant less water needed to drain for the same vertical distance, roughly balancing the slower flow rate. The most sophisticated solution was the inflow clepsydra with a float regulator, which we'll explore shortly. The outflow clepsydra, water draining out of a container, was the simpler and more common type. You filled it, let it drain, and when it was empty, time was up. This type was perfect for situations where you needed to measure a fixed interval: a speaker's allotted time in court, a soldier's guard shift, the duration of a specific activity. The Romans used these extensively because they were cheap, portable, and required no special expertise to operate. Any slave or attendant could fill a pot with water and watch it drain. The inflow clepsydra was more complex but more accurate. Instead of measuring time by water draining out, it measured time by water flowing in. A reservoir with a regulated outflow dripped water at a constant rate into a receiving vessel. As the receiving vessel filled, a float rose with the water level. The float was connected to a pointer that indicated the time on a marked scale. This design solved the decreasing pressure problem because the reservoir could be kept at a constant level, ensuring steady flow. The float mechanism was a genuine engineering innovation. Imagine a small platform floating on the water surface in the receiving vessel. As water drips in, the float rises. A rod attached to the float extends upward, and at the top it connects to a pointer or to a system of gears that turn a dial. The rising float translates into visible time indication. Some elaborate clepsydrae had the pointer indicate hours on a drum that could be rotated to adjust for seasonal variations. We'll get to that complication later. Vitruvius, the Roman architect and engineer who wrote extensively about construction and mechanics in the 1st century BCE, described several types of water clocks in his famous work on architecture. His descriptions give us our best understanding of how sophisticated Roman clepsydrae actually were. He described clocks with rotating drums marked with hour lines, with pointers driven by floats, with mechanisms to sound alarms at specific times. Some of these designs were remarkably complex, approaching the sophistication of medieval mechanical clocks in their ingenuity, if not their precision. But let's move from engineering to application, because the clepsydra's real significance lies in how the Romans used it to organize their society, and nowhere was this more dramatic than in the Roman courts. Roman legal proceedings operated under strict time limits enforced by water clocks. When a lawyer rose to speak, an attendant would fill a clepsydra and set it dripping. The lawyer could speak until the water ran out. When it did, he had to stop, immediately, without finishing his sentence if necessary. The phrase aquam dare, meaning to give water, became the standard expression for granting someone speaking time. The judge might say he was giving the prosecution 3 clepsydrae and the defence 2, meaning the prosecution had 3 water clock intervals to make their case, while the defence had only 2. This system had profound effects on Roman rhetoric and legal practice. Lawyers had to be concise. They couldn't ramble or repeat themselves endlessly. They had to make their strongest arguments quickly and efficiently because the water was always draining. Some lawyers became famous for their ability to compress complex arguments into limited time. Others developed strategies for using their opponent's time against them, asking questions that required long answers, forcing the other side to waste their precious water on explanations rather than arguments. The great orator Cicero, whose speeches are among our best sources for Roman legal practice, frequently references water clocks in his writings. He complains about cases where he wasn't given enough water to make his arguments properly. He boasts about cases where he finished with water to spare, demonstrating his efficiency. He discusses the tactics of requesting more water or objecting to an opponent's time allocation. The clepsydra wasn't just a timing device, it was a strategic element of Roman litigation. Different types of cases received different time allocations. A minor civil dispute might get 1 clepsydra per side. A major criminal trial might allow many hours of argument spread across multiple days. The presiding magistrate had discretion to adjust allocations based on the complexity of the case, but the water clock remained the ultimate arbiter. When the water stopped flowing, the speaking stopped too. The psychological pressure of the draining clepsydra must have been intense. Imagine making the most important argument of your career, knowing that every second of hesitation, every unnecessary word, brings you closer to being cut off. The water doesn't care about your eloquence or your client's innocence. It just drains, steadily, inexorably, until it's gone. Roman lawyers learned to speak with one eye on their argument and one eye on the water level. Some lawyers tried to game the system. There are accounts of advocates speaking very slowly during their opponent's time, asking long-winded questions to waste the other side's water. There are stories of attendants being bribed to use clepsydrae with larger holes, making the water drain faster for one side than the other. There are complaints about clepsydrae being improperly filled, or the water being unusually warm. Warm water flows faster than cold. The water clock created a whole ecosystem of time-based tactics and counter-tactics. The military application of water clocks was equally important, though less dramatic than courtroom confrontations. Roman military camps operated on a strict schedule, and nowhere was timing more critical than in the night watch system. The Roman night was divided into 4 vigilia, watches, each lasting approximately 3 hours. Guards stood duty for one watch, then were relieved by the next shift. Getting this timing right was essential for camp security and soldier welfare. Imagine you're a Roman legionary assigned to the 3rd watch on a cold winter night. You need to know when your shift starts and when it ends. You can't see the sun. It's night. You can't easily count hours in your head while standing guard in the darkness. You need some objective measure of time passing. That measure was the water clock. Military camps had designated timekeepers, usually under the supervision of centurions, who maintained water clocks and signalled watch changes. When a clepsydra emptied, marking the end of a watch, a horn would sound or a signal would be given, and the guard shifts would change. The outgoing guards could finally rest. The incoming guards took their positions. This happened 4 times every night, across every Roman military camp from Britain to Syria. The precision of this system mattered enormously. If watch changes were unpredictable, guards wouldn't know when they'd be relieved. Morale would suffer. Tired soldiers might fall asleep at their posts, creating security vulnerabilities. Enemies might learn to attack during the confused moments of shift changes. The water clock imposed order on the night, creating predictable intervals that soldiers could count on. But here's where Roman timekeeping gets strange, at least to modern sensibilities. Roman hours weren't all the same length. The Romans divided the day into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night, regardless of the actual duration of daylight and darkness. In summer, when days are long, each daytime hour was longer than 60 minutes by our reckoning. In winter, when days are short, daytime hours were shorter. The same applied to nighttime hours, but in reverse. Winter nights had longer hours than summer nights. This system of unequal hours or temporal hours seems bizarre to us, but it made sense in a world without artificial lighting. Romans organized their activities around daylight. They rose at dawn, worked during the day, and went to bed not long after sunset. Dividing the available daylight into 12 equal parts, whatever the season, meant that the 6th hour was always midday, the 1st hour was always early morning, and the 12th hour was always late afternoon. The actual duration varied, but the social meaning remained constant. Water clocks had to be adjusted for this seasonal variation. A clepsydra calibrated for summer hours would run too fast in winter, indicating hour changes before they should occur. Sophisticated clepsydrae had adjustable scales or interchangeable drums marked with different hour lengths for different seasons. Simpler clepsydrae required recalibration, changing the water level, adjusting the flow rate, or simply using different vessels for different seasons. The Roman architect Vitruvius describes an ingenious solution, a clepsydra with a rotating drum marked with hour lines that varied in spacing around the circumference. By rotating the drum to the appropriate position for the current season, the same clock could accurately indicate unequal hours throughout the year. This was sophisticated engineering, requiring careful calculation of how hour lengths varied across the seasons and precise marking of the drum surface. Not everyone had access to such sophisticated devices. Wealthy Romans might own elaborate household clepsydrae, decorative as well as functional, maintained by trained slaves. But ordinary Romans relied on simpler methods for knowing the time. During the day, sundials were common. Every forum had public sundials, and many private homes had them in gardens or courtyards. The shadow's position indicated the hour, at least when the sun was shining. At night or on cloudy days, public water clocks in forums and basilicas served similar functions. Town criers might announce the hours, walking through streets and calling out the time for those who couldn't see a clock. Bells or horns might sound at significant hours. The Romans had created a public timekeeping infrastructure, imperfect by our standards, but functional for their needs. Private households with clepsydrae used them for various purposes. Timing dinner parties was common. Romans ate their main meal in the evening, and the duration of a dinner party was a matter of social significance. Too short suggested stinginess or poor hospitality. Too long suggested excess. A host might instruct slaves to begin serving the next course when a clepsydra emptied, pacing the meal according to water rather than hunger. Some wealthy Romans used water clocks to time their own activities: reading, exercise, bathing. The philosopher Seneca wrote about the importance of not wasting time, of being conscious of how one spent one's hours. A clepsydra made this consciousness tangible, turning abstract time into visible water draining away. Seneca's philosophical reflections on time often reference the physical reality of water clocks, the way they made time's passage something you could see and measure. The accuracy of Roman water clocks was limited by factors the Romans only partially understood. Temperature affected water viscosity. Warm water flows faster than cold water through the same hole. Impurities in the water could clog the outflow hole, slowing the flow. The hole itself could erode over time, changing the flow rate. Atmospheric pressure, though the Romans didn't understand it as we do, also affected flow rates slightly. A clepsydra that was accurate in Rome might run differently in Alexandria or Londinium due to climate differences. Despite these limitations, water clocks were accurate enough for Roman purposes. They didn't need to measure time to the second or even to the minute. They needed to measure intervals, how long a lawyer could speak. When guard shifts changed, how long until dinner was served. For these purposes, accuracy within a few minutes was sufficient, and water clocks could achieve that when properly maintained. The Romans also used water clocks in combination with other timekeeping methods. Sundials provided daytime reference points that could be used to check and calibrate water clocks. The position of stars at night gave experienced observers rough time indications. The crowing of roosters, the habits of animals, the rhythms of daily life all provided informal time cues. Water clocks fit into this ecosystem of timekeeping methods, providing precision when needed but not replacing other ways of tracking time's passage. Archaeological evidence for Roman water clocks is frustratingly limited. The devices were made of materials that don't survive well: clay, bronze, wood, leather. We have fragments, but few complete examples. What we know comes largely from written descriptions, particularly Vitruvius, supplemented by artistic depictions and the occasional archaeological find. Reconstructions based on these sources suggest that Roman clepsydrae ranged from simple clay pots to elaborate bronze mechanisms, from cheap disposable items to expensive luxury goods. The Tower of the Winds in Athens, built in the 1st century BCE, included a water clock mechanism that has been partially reconstructed. Though Greek rather than Roman, it gives us insight into the sophisticated clepsydrae available in the Mediterranean world during the Roman period. The mechanism used a float-driven pointer system to indicate hours on a rotating dial, with provisions for seasonal adjustment. Similar devices almost certainly existed in Rome, though none have survived intact. Comparing Roman water clocks to those of other cultures highlights both common solutions and unique adaptations. Egyptian water clocks, the oldest known, were simple outflow types with hour markings on the interior. Chinese water clocks developed along different lines, eventually incorporating elaborate mechanisms with multiple vessels and overflow systems. Islamic engineers later created extraordinarily sophisticated water clocks with automata, moving figures, sounding bells, dropping balls, that far exceeded anything the Romans built. The Romans were competent water clock users and modest innovators, but not the leading edge of this technology. The cultural significance of Roman timekeeping extended beyond practical applications. Time consciousness, awareness of time passing, concern with using time well, anxiety about time wasted, was a distinctly Roman characteristic that the clepsydra both reflected and reinforced. Roman literature is full of references to time's value, to the importance of not squandering one's hours, to the way life drains away like water from a vessel. The clepsydra provided a powerful metaphor. Your life is the water, dripping steadily away, and you cannot refill the vessel. The legal use of water clocks also reflected Roman values about fairness and procedure. By imposing objective time limits on speakers, the clepsydra prevented wealthy litigants from simply overwhelming opponents with endless argument. A poor man with a good case and limited time had a fighting chance against a rich man with many lawyers, because the water ran out for everyone. This wasn't perfect equality. The rich could still hire better lawyers who used time more effectively, but it was a structural limit on the advantages of wealth. Military timekeeping reflected Roman values about discipline and organization. The legion's success depended on soldiers doing the right thing at the right time, whether that meant marching in formation, executing tactical maneuvers, or standing guard through the night. Water clocks helped impose this discipline, creating objective standards that applied equally to all soldiers, regardless of rank or preference. When the water said your watch was over, your watch was over. No negotiation, no exceptions. The transition from Roman water clocks to medieval mechanical clocks took centuries and involved significant technological innovation. Mechanical clocks, powered by weights and regulated by escapements, could achieve much greater accuracy than water clocks, and didn't require constant refilling or seasonal adjustment. But they were also more complex, more expensive, and more difficult to maintain. Water clocks remained in use for specific purposes well into the medieval period, even as mechanical clocks became available for those who could afford them. The legacy of Roman timekeeping extends into our modern world in subtle ways. Our concept of dividing the day into hours, our expectation that public spaces will display the time, our use of time limits in legal and parliamentary proceedings, all have roots in Roman practice. The Romans didn't invent these ideas, but they institutionalized them, making timekeeping a matter of public concern rather than private convenience. Modern water clocks exist mostly as curiosities or educational demonstrations, but the principles remain valid. Water still flows at predictable rates. Floats still rise as vessels fill. The physics that made Roman clepsydra work would make a water clock work today. What's changed is our need for precision. We want accuracy to the second, not the quarter hour, and our access to technologies that can provide it. The story of Roman water clocks is ultimately a story about human ingenuity applied to a universal problem. How do we measure something we cannot see or touch? Time has no physical substance. It doesn't reflect light or make sounds. It simply passes, carrying us along whether we notice or not. The Romans, like every human society, needed ways to make time tangible, to convert its invisible passage into something they could observe and measure and use to organize their lives. Water provided that conversion. The dripping of water, steady and visible, translated time's passage into something physical. A lawyer watching the water level drop knew exactly how much time remained. A soldier watching the clepsydra empty knew his shift was ending. A host watching the water drain knew when to serve the next course. The abstraction of time became the concrete reality of water, and through that conversion, the Romans built institutions and practices that shaped their world. The limitations of water clocks remind us that precision is relative to need. The Romans didn't need atomic clock accuracy. They needed to know roughly what time it was, to measure intervals for specific purposes, to coordinate activities across their society. Water clocks met these needs well enough. The fact that they couldn't measure seconds, that they varied with temperature and season, that they required constant attention, these limitations didn't prevent the Romans from building an empire, trying cases, guarding camps, or hosting dinner parties. Perhaps there's a lesson here for our own time-obsessed age. We have access to timekeeping precision the Romans couldn't have imagined. Our phones synchronize with atomic clocks, accurate to billionths of a second. Yet we often feel more pressed for time than the Romans did, more anxious about wasting it, more desperate to squeeze productivity from every moment. The Romans, with their dripping water and unequal hours, might have had a healthier relationship with time than we do. They knew time was limited. The clepsydra made that viscerally clear, but they didn't try to measure it to the nanosecond. As we reflect on Roman water clocks, those simple vessels of clay and bronze, those floats rising slowly in receiving chambers, those attendants watching the water drain while lawyers argued and soldiers stood guard, we see an ancient solution to a timeless problem. The technology was primitive by our standards. The accuracy was limited. The system required constant human attention. But it worked. For centuries across an empire spanning 3 continents, water clocks helped Romans organize their days, their courts, their armies, their social lives. The next time you glance at your phone to check the time, consider for a moment the Roman lawyer who glanced at a clay pot, watching the water level drop, knowing that when it emptied, his chance to save his client would end. Consider the soldier in a cold German forest, watching the clepsydra in the guard post, waiting for the water to run out so he could finally sleep. Consider the dinner guest, watching the host's slave monitor the household water clock, timing the courses of an elaborate meal. Time mattered to them as it matters to us. They just measured it differently, with water dripping in the darkness, marking the hours until dawn.